What up, everyone? It's your boy Young Dev. We're out here. Another episode. Welcome. So today's episode is a bit different, right? It's a bit different. I decided to come outside today. You know what I mean? I decided to come outside. We've been always indoors, talking from inside the house. But today, let's just be outdoors, man. Let's just be outdoors. We're talking about how to plan a software project, right? So, like, hey, today's episode is a bit different. Like, we're talking about how to plan a software project. So, planning a software project is very, very important if you're starting a new project, right? Whether you are it's a company project or it's a personal project, you know what I mean? So it doesn't matter like the scale of the project or how small the project is. You always need to make sure that you put a proper plan for your software project, right? Because now look, let's say for instance you just decide to do a project without planning. There'll be a lot of hiccups, there'll be a lot of problems, because now the thing is you didn't plan, there's nothing to follow, because planning gives you that workflow to follow, or it gives you that workflow so that you can streamline the project, right? Okay, so but before we even go to the important things about planning a project or start talking about those kind of things and whatsoever, what is important is you must make sure that the app architecture is into place, because the most important aspect of planning a project is an application architecture. Whether we are planning a project, it's a web application or it's a mobile application or any kind of an application, definitely need to make sure that the application architecture is into place, because the application architecture gives you that direction to start planning your project or start building your project for that matter. Because imagine you build a project, and then only to find 2 months or 3 months down the line that you are off direction. So it's very important to make sure that the application architecture is up to place, right? Okay, so let's dive to step number 1. So you're talking about how to plan a software project. It's not the way, but it's a right way you can use to plan a software project, right? Okay, so for you to be able to execute your project properly, for you to be able to execute your software properly, you need a proper planning, right? So that because you're gonna use it as a flow to build your application, right? To use it as a flow to build your application or to build your software, right? So that is why you need a proper planning, so that you don't end up going off direction of your application, right? Because the most important thing you need to do is to make sure that you execute your application or you execute your project in the right way, like the way it's supposed to be. Because before you even decide to create a project or you decide to create a system or something like that, you know how you want it to be. You know exactly how you want it to be. I want the button to be there. I want whatever. You know what I'm saying? So that's what planning is for. Planning is for helping you to make sure that you execute your project properly. All right. You need to clearly make sure that you outline what is your software is, what your software does, what is it for, who's intended for, and what it's supposed to achieve. Right. That is part of proper planning. So so that you need to know that what your software is supposed to achieve. Is it supposed to achieve a certain goal? Is supposed to create a certain service, or is it a solution to a certain problem? So that's what you need to make sure. You need to understand what your software is supposed to achieve, right? And then you need to set realistic goals and achieve and priority features. Like, come on, like everything you need to set some goals, right? You set some goals and say, okay, fine, I want to achieve this maybe in 2 weeks time, or in 3 weeks time I want to achieve this, in 4 weeks time I want to achieve this, in 1 month's time I want to achieve this, and that. So that is where you are setting realistic goals, and also you are setting priorities, because not everything has the highest priority. So you need to make sure that your priorities are set high, and then you set the realistic goals for your software application, because now you need to understand what your software does, like, you know what I mean? And then after that you set those priorities, and then you develop based on those priorities. The item with the highest priority must be developed first. Now, proper planning comes with a lot of things in mind. It comes with setting the project timeline, comes with setting priorities. It comes with the project timeline, right? You have to specify the project timeline that, okay, as we did say that you want to set realistic goals, but then there should be a timeline for your software application, or there should be a timeline for your software project. Definitely need to have a proper project timeline. It comes with project planning, so that because when you start doing that, you will be able to now allocate the resources efficiently, because now we're talking about enterprise application. You need to allocate resources efficiently. You need to allocate developers to your project. You need to allocate business analysts. You need to allocate testers, and so forth, right? But then if it's your personal project, you also need to allocate resources. You need to allocate your time correctly. So, okay, fine. I want to do this at a specific time. I want to achieve this at a certain time. So you need to allocate resources efficiently. And then, okay, before we even go to talking about the tech stack, because that's one important thing, you need to understanding to make sure that you choose the right tech stack, because there are a lot of programming languages out there. There's Java, C#, whatever you can use, and there's also a lot of front-end frameworks, React, Angular, and so forth. So choosing the right tech stack, a technology stack, is gonna make your life very easy, because now you don't want to mix things right now. Like, come on, you don't want to create a project and then two weeks down the line you'll be like, was I supposed to use Java on this one? Was I supposed to use Java or C#? So, but then that comes with research. That's definitely comes with researching and understanding what technology stack you want to use. C#, Java, Python for backend, whatever you decide to use. We'll talk about the tech stack, don't know. We'll talk about choosing the right technology stack, because that also plays a very, very important role in making sure that your project is being completed in time, and then your project is being executed correctly, right? The role of architect and design in your project or in your software project, right? What is the role of architect and design? So, if you can talk about design, not basically talking about you creating those fancy UI UX using InVision, using Adobe XD, whatever, just creating those simple wireframes from a pen and paper. That's a first start. You understand what pages you want. If your application is a web application or if it's a mobile application, you know what pages you want, and you know what transitions you want from the application. So if the user or if the client, whoever will be interacting with the application, is in this page or is in at this point, and then what's the next step to follow? If I click on this button, what should come next? If I'm logging in, what's the first page that I need to interact with? If I go to settings, what are the page that needs to come from the application? You know what I'm saying? So you need to make sure that the architect and the design is well in place, because now if you don't have an architect, because even before even talk about architect, because like architect is quite big and it's quite broad, and you might need to have like an extreme experience for you to be able to create a well designed application architect, right? That is why companies, they hire people like architects to do that job. You know what I'm saying? Because you're a dev, man. You're a dev. Come on. But then it's not a problem to be ambitious, to know these things. To be honest, for me, I know a lot of these things, and because I know I have a lot of projects that I want to do myself, so that I can't rely on someone else to do these things for me. So I feel like it's a good investment for yourself as well. It's a good skill to have, to understand how to do the proper design, how to do an architect for your application, how to develop your application. But the main core is developing the application. But we'll get that before you can even kick off in terms of production or in terms of development. So the architect, why is architect important? Because now look at this, you want to consider things like scalability, right? You don't want your projects to only like, for instance, you can't have an application or a project or a software which only has like 1 to 2 users, 5 to 10 users. Like, you need to be able to scale your application in such a way that if it happens that your application, you get more users, or you will get more interaction, application doesn't break. Imagine now you can't log in, 10 people can't be in the system. You created a system for like 2 people, like, you know what I'm saying? So architect comes in play for scalability, right? Look at things like MVC, model view controller, MVVM, performance and security. Because now when you start dwelling more, let me come closer for this one. When you start dwelling more on architecture, this is where you are outlining things like MVC, scalability, security, and performance of your application, right? The most important thing, you want your application to be secured, right? You don't want third party or other people to be able to gain access in your application. Like, come on, you don't want hackers to hack your system, you know what I'm saying? And you want a high performance, because now the chances are your system will be used by so many users, right? It will be used by so many users, and you want to have highest performance. Whatever they are doing, you need to have highest performance. That's it. You know what I'm saying? So in terms of architect, that is where you start deciding in terms of what kind of system you are building. Are you building a microservice? Are you building a monolithic service? Is it an MVC, an REST API, or whatsoever? So this is where those things come in play for an architect. You start talking about monolithic services, monolithic architecture. I mean, you start talking about model view controller. You start talking about not more than view control. Start talking about microservices, scalability of an application. You start talking about where to deploy your application. You start talking about what kind of database you'll be using. So basically, that is where now you start talking about these things. You start outlining these things before you can even dive into development. And then you are planning a system design. And planning a system design is what we talked about, like having a UI UX, having a flow chart, and say, if I'm here, the next step is to do this and this and this and this. If it's it's a game or whatever, you do this. This is the scene, the first scene, the second scene. It's like directing, man. You know, when people are shooting a music video, they direct these things like, okay, this is the first scene, the second scene, and so forth and so forth. It's like scripting, basically. So you need to have those things like flow charts, UI UX. So that's basically what we are talking about. We're talking about app architecture and design. We are outlining things like scalability, performance, security, microservice, choosing between microservice, web API, or monolithic service. We talk about things like flowcharts for design. We talk about things like a UI UX design. So that's, because the most important thing is not to create your system in the first 2 months and then it does everything. That's not the case. The case is to have an MVC and then an MVP. Not an MVC, man. The first thing is to have an MVP. After having an MVP, that is when you can start giving us the actual project, and then you start developing the project, adding some extra features and so forth and so forth. So now we spoke about architect, we spoke about design, we spoke about diagrams, flowcharts, and UI UX and so forth, right? So now it comes in play when you have decided what you want to build. Are you building a microservice architect, or are you using a web API, or are you using a monolithic service, right? So we'll discuss those things in a different video, because it's a very high level topic on its own. Like, it's a very high level topic on its own. Power of API and microservice, right? So we need to talk about API design. One mistake I know people do is that, like, they tend to create web APIs or REST APIs before even designing the actual API, and then they struggle within the process of developing that API, because you need to design that API. You need to understand what services from that API that you are exposing, what is the security for that API, what is the functionality, or what is the business service for that API, what is the operation and functionalities of that API. So basically, you need to design your web API now. You have to design your services. You need to understand what services you're creating. Are they talking to each other? What are they exposing? What is the security of those services? And then what data they are exposing, or what data they're returning, or where are they fetching data? Where are you saving that data? And all those kind of things. So now, when you're talking about designing an API, right? Talking about API design, you're talking about microservices. We have these services. We have these microservices. We're talking about designing an API, right? That is where you talk about your REST API, your GraphQL, because you need to have a well documentation for your API. You know what I'm saying? So that it can be easy to integrate your API. So because if you're having a proper documentation for your API, it will be easy to integrate your API with other services or with your application, if that's the case. You know what I'm saying? Because you have a proper documentation for your API, then which means gonna give you a proper integration or easy integration with your API while you're still working on that API yourself before even having to deploy the application and so forth, right? And then another thing is when it comes to microservices now, the power of microservice, then that is where you start talking things about scalability. Remember, we touched base on scalabilities, right? That is where we start talking about scalability. Okay, fine. This is how I can scale my application. This is how I can scale my services. The question is, when you're deciding between an API and a microservices, I'm laughing because I once had this issue before, and I'm saying, when you are deciding in terms of you need to make a right choice, and I'm saying you need to ask yourself, is that this is the question you need to ask yourself: is breaking my application into microservices the right choice for this particular application, right? Because you might make that mistake, create an application as a microservice, only to find that there's actually no need to break your application into microservices. You can just create a web API fully, and then that's it. You know what I'm saying? But then also, with an API, have you well documented it? Have you designed it properly to understand the security of your API, the easy integration of your API, the performance of your API and security and so forth. So those are two important things when you start talking about API design and microservices. You need to understand if you have to, or do you really need to break your application into microservices? Is it the right choice for you to do it? And also, if it's not, but then now, have you documented your API properly in terms of, so that you know when you start developing it, it's an easy integration? That's the question you need to ask yourself as well. And then when you talk about microservices, then if you decide to go with microservices, scalability, you need to start understanding scalabilities. You need to start understanding flexibilities as well. So those are two things that you need to understand when you're talking about microservices and APIs, right? Is it a right choice? Like, because I know I once been there. I know some people are watching this video, they'll agree to that, man. I once decided to break my application into microservices, only to find out that I really did not need to. So it's a very important it's a very important thing to know. So when you're talking about version control and collaboration, you're talking about things which will help you control, and also things which are going to help you collaborate more with other developers or with your team, right? Also, Git is the most popular choice that you can use for version control, right? So when you're talking about Git, talk about your version control system that you can use for collaboration and also to push your code or changes and all those kind of things. We all know Git and we all know version control. But then now, when you're working with Git, there are a lot of choices you can use as well. Can you have GitLab? Can you have Git Bash? Can have GitHub? Can have Bitbucket and so forth? But GitHub is the mostly used, I believe, because I feel like Bitbucket is more of a corporate. So you can utilize with GitHub. Let's say, for instance, you're utilizing GitHub for collaboration or Bitbucket or whatsoever, depending on what your choice is, right? You made that choice. I don't think there's much of how can I put? I don't think there's a lot to look at when you want to decide which collaboration tool or version control system you want to use in terms of GitHub or Bitbucket or GitLab. It's matter of a preference. You know what I'm saying? So remember, on our last video, we talked about the importance of code review. So that is where those things come in play. So whereby if you're working with a lot of team, then that is where you start having things like code reviews, having things like pull request, version control, and all those kind of things. So there's not much to talk about when it comes to version control, other than telling you it's either choosing GitHub, GitLab, or Bitbucket, right? So that you can collaborate more efficiently with your team, and then to be able to manage your code base. Right. Okay. Let's talk about the documentation and maintenance in the long term, right? So you make sure that you have a clear documentation for your application. We spoke about having a clear design for application, but now we're talking about having a clear documentation. Things like Confluence. You can utilize Confluence to document your application, because now it's make things easy for us, and also it makes things easy for yourself as a designer, or as a developer, or as an owner of that system or that project. If you document it correctly, you'll know exactly how things are supposed to be done and how things are supposed to be followed. So think about those things, that they want to bring you like a lot of advantage if you're utilizing them in that set. Before you can even dive deep into development, before even diving deep into development, if there is a proper planning for your software application, it's gonna be very easy for you to start doing your development. You know what I'm saying? You won't have much problems. Obviously, there are problems along the way and so forth, but then you won't have as much problems as not documenting your application, in terms of looking for API design, microservices, and all those kind of things. So that's basically it for today's video. We're talking about how to plan a software project. So there are some things which I might have not mentioned, and you feel like they are critical or they are crucial in terms of software planning or a software project. Then after you've done all these things, after you've planned your project, after you've done all these things that we've spoken about, or all these things that we've talked about, then that is where you can start doing the kickoff, right? Because even the kickoff is very important. Another thing, when you start doing the kickoff, the development as such, it's very important to understand if it's a personal project or if it's an enterprise project or if it's an enterprise software or whatever. Deciding what to start with in terms of development is very important as well, because you might start designing or you might start developing a back end first, because you'll have a back end. Maybe your application might need to have a front end, or it might not. So if, let's say for instance, let's for argument's sake and say we have a full stack application, there's a front end involved, there's a back end involved, there's deployment involved, there's all those kind of things which are involved in a certain typical application, right? So it's very important as well to also understand and also to decide what aspects you are starting with. Are you starting with the back end, or are you starting with the front end, or are you starting with setting up the servers? I feel like that's the first thing you need to do. Maybe start setting up all your servers, have the servers ready in place, have all the infrastructure in place if you have like some users or whatever. Have all those kind of things ready, have the servers in place, have the SSL certificates in terms of security if you want the application to be secured, of which I believe you do. And then once all those things in terms of infrastructure, the servers, the setup is done, all those things they've been taken care of, then that is when you can start doing a development. But I believe for myself, on a personal level, I feel like if you have the prototype, if you have an MVP, if you have a design, if you have a UI UX design, I feel like it's much easier to start with the back end. For me personally, I usually start with the back end. Like, I usually start with the back end because I'm much of a back end developer than of a front end. But I feel like it's much easier to start with the back end so that you get off all this work. And then by the time you start focusing on your front end, you just have to call these certain services which are coming, to avoid using dummy data as well, because you tend to use dummy data if you are working on front end. If for instance you are working with Angular, there are some services that you need to build, and then there are some API calls that you need to make. You start having to work with dummy data, and then I feel like that's, I'm not gonna say it's a waste of time, but sometimes you can just avoid it too by just creating a back end first. And then before you build your front end, and the back end is already sorted, the back end is already up and running, and then you can start focusing on the front end, right? You know what I mean? And then that is when you are building your MVP. Now that is when you are building your MVP, and then you break down your development into phases or into deliverables. You know what I'm saying? There's deliverable 1, there's deliverable 2, and so forth, or phase 1 and phase 2. Then you start shipping those phases. You start deploying those phases in different stages, and then in different timelines, because we spoke about project timeline. So yep. So that's it about project design and planning a project. So that's basically it. So today I will see you on the next video. Peace.